Princess Lyra of Villara was once the shining star of her planet. As the daughter of the king, she was loved by the people and admired for her wisdom. She had everything: wealth, power, and a life full of promise. But all of that changed in the blink of an eye. One fateful day, a warlord from a neighboring galaxy attacked Villara. His army was ruthless and swift. They crushed the defenses of the planet in a matter of hours. Lyra's kingdom fell before she could even react. Her father, the king, made a difficult decision. He ordered the evacuation of the royal family. The princess was to be sent to a safe location, far from the war. But things did not go as planned. The royal guards betrayed her. They saw the war coming, and fearing for their own lives, they abandoned Lyra. She was left behind in the palace, alone and scared. Her heart sank as the sounds of battle grew closer. The princess couldn't understand how the people she had trusted could leave her to die. The once grand palace was now in ruins, and the invaders were closing in. The once beautiful gardens were now filled with smoke, and the streets echoed with the sounds of war. As the invaders approached, Lyra's thoughts raced. She had no weapons, no allies, and no way to escape. She tried to hide in the shadows of the ruined palace, praying they wouldn't find her. But the enemy was relentless. They searched every corner, looking for anyone who might stand in their way. Lyra had lost everything: her family, her home, and her people. She felt the weight of despair pressing down on her. There seemed to be no hope left. She had heard stories of how the invaders took prisoners, but she feared they would not spare her life. She was just a princess after all. What use was she to them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise, a rustling sound coming from the nearby bushes. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized someone, or something, was nearby. Could it be the invaders? She held her breath, hoping to remain unseen. To her surprise, the rustling didn't come from enemy soldiers. It was a dog, a large, strong dog, with dark fur and a look of intelligence in its eyes. The dog's gaze met hers, and for a moment, Lyra didn't know whether to be afraid or relieved. She had no idea where this dog had come from, but something about him felt different. The dog approached slowly, his steps cautious but purposeful. His eyes never left hers. Lyra didn't know what to think. She had seen many creatures in her life, but nothing like this. She was too weak to move or run. But to her shock, the dog sat down beside her, as though offering her protection. Lyra stared at him, confused and unsure. Why would this dog be here? Could it be a sign of hope in this dark moment? Little did Lyra know, this dog was no ordinary animal. This was Rex, a loyal war dog, genetically enhanced for intelligence and strength. Rex had been left behind by his human handler, Sergeant James Thompson, who had been captured by the enemy. Rex, however, refused to abandon his duty. He had a mission to complete, and he had found the princess. His instincts told him that she was important, and he would not leave her side. As Lyra watched the dog, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone after all. Lyra sat in the ruins of her once great palace, staring at the large dog that had appeared out of nowhere. His fur was dark and rough, but his eyes held something different. There was a look of loyalty in his gaze, as if he was determined to protect her at all costs. Lyra had never seen a creature like him before. Her heart, heavy with the weight of everything she had lost, began to feel a flicker of hope. Could this be the help she so desperately needed? She slowly reached out a trembling hand towards the dog. Rex didn't flinch. He sat still, watching her intently. She couldn't help but wonder where he had come from, and what he was doing here, in the middle of a war zone. But in that moment, none of the questions mattered. The dog had found her, and in a world full of uncertainty and pain, that was enough. With the dog by her side, Lyra felt a strange sense of calm. The chaos of the battle outside seemed distant now. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to close her eyes and take a deep breath. She didn't know where she would go or what would happen next, but at least she wasn't alone. At least for the moment, she had someone to stand by her. Hours passed, and the sounds of war grew louder again. Lyra's mind raced with thoughts of escape, but there was nowhere to run. The palace was surrounded. The enemy was everywhere, and she had no idea where to go. Rex, however, seemed calm, as if he had a plan. He stood up and nudged her gently with his nose, urging her to follow him. It was clear that he wasn't about to leave her behind. Lyra hesitated for a moment. She had no weapons, no way to defend herself, and she couldn't outrun the soldiers chasing her. But the dog's presence gave her a strange sense of courage. She rose to her feet, carefully following Rex as he led the way through the broken corridors of the palace. As they moved through the wreckage, Lyra's thoughts returned to her family. She had been the princess of Velara, loved by her people and protected by her father's kingdom. Now, all of that was gone. She had been abandoned by her guards, left behind to die, with no one to rely on except a strange dog. She felt the sting of loss deep in her heart, but there was no time for mourning. The world was still burning, and she had to survive. Rex stopped suddenly, his ears perked up. He looked around, his eyes scanning the area. Lyra followed his gaze and saw what he had noticed: a group of enemy soldiers moving toward the palace. Her heart sank. If they found her now, she wouldn't have a chance. The dog growled low in his throat, his muscles tensing. Lyra knew that the soldiers would be close. There was no time to waste. Rex moved toward the back of the palace, where a hidden door led to the gardens. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Could they make it out without being seen? With Rex leading the way, she followed the dog through the door and into the garden. The moonlight was dim, but it was enough to light their path. Lyra's heart raced as they moved quietly, trying to avoid the soldiers who were searching for her. The garden seemed endless, the tall plants and trees offering some cover, but not much. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Lyra's stomach churned with fear. She didn't know how long they could keep hiding. Rex stopped again, his nose twitching. Then he turned to her and gave a soft bark, as if telling her to stay still. Lyra crouched down beside the dog, holding her breath. The footsteps were closer now, and she could see the dark figures of the soldiers moving in the distance. In that moment, Lyra realized something. This dog, Rex, was her only hope, and she wasn't going to give up now. With Rex by her side, she would fight for survival. The soldiers were closing in. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, every muscle in her body tense. The garden, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a trap. She could hear the soldiers talking, their voices growing louder with every passing second. Her pulse quickened as she crouched lower to the ground, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. Rex was still beside her, his body stiff, ears alert. The dog's presence gave her a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. Lyra had never been so close to death, but with Rex by her side, it felt like there might still be a chance. The soldiers, oblivious to their presence, moved past them, their voices fading into the distance. Lyra held her breath, barely daring to move. She looked at Rex, whose eyes were fixed on the retreating figures. When the danger seemed to pass, the dog nudged her gently, urging her to move. Without a word, Lyra followed him. The garden's dense foliage hid them for now, but they couldn't stay here forever. The soldiers would circle back soon, and they had to keep moving. Rex led her down a narrow path that twisted through the trees, the underbrush scratching at her skin as they moved. Lyra's thoughts raced. Where were they going? Could Rex really lead her to safety? As they moved deeper into the garden, Lyra caught a glimpse of something unusual. At the end of the path was a small, hidden entrance carved into the side of the palace wall. The door was old, weathered, but still intact. It looked like it had been there for ages, yet no one had noticed it. Rex stopped in front of the door, looking back at her. It was clear that this was the way forward. Lyra hesitated for a moment, but the urgency in Rex's eyes pushed her forward. She reached out and grabbed the door handle. It creaked open, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. The air inside the tunnel was cool and musty, a sharp contrast to the heat and chaos outside. Lyra stepped inside, and Rex followed closely behind, his paws making no sound on the stone floor. They moved quietly, the tunnel twisting and turning as they descended deeper into the bowels of the palace. Lyra couldn't help but wonder how Rex had found this secret passage. Had he known about it all along? Or had he been guided by instinct? Either way, she was grateful. This tunnel might be their only chance to escape. They walked for what felt like hours, the only sound the soft padding of Rex's paws and the occasional rustling of Lyra's dress. The tunnel seemed endless, but she couldn't stop now. She had no choice but to trust the dog. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and artifacts. Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. It seemed safe for now, but the question still lingered. Where could they go from here? Rex padded over to a large chest in the corner of the room. He nudged it with his nose, as if trying to get her attention. Lyra approached him, curiosity piqued. What was inside? She opened the chest, her hands trembling. Inside were several weapons, blasters, knives, and other tools of survival. Her eyes widened. Was this a stash left behind by her father's soldiers? It seemed like something they would use for their last line of defense. With shaking hands, Lyra took one of the blasters. It felt strange in her hands, but she knew she had to be ready. She couldn't rely on Rex alone. They would need to fight if they wanted to survive. Rex let out a low growl, his head tilted toward the tunnel entrance. Lyra felt her stomach drop. The soldiers must have found the tunnel. They were getting closer. She turned to Rex, determination filling her. We're not giving up, Rex. We're not going to let them win. The dog barked softly, as if in agreement. Together, they would face whatever came next. The sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel, growing louder with every passing second. Lyra's heart raced as she tightened her grip on the blaster. Rex stood beside her, his body tense, his ears alert. They had to move quickly if they were going to escape. The soldiers would soon be upon them. Lyra glanced around the small room. The dim light from a few candles flickered in the corners, casting long shadows on the walls. She could hear the soldiers talking in the distance, their voices muffled but unmistakable. They were searching for her, and she couldn't stay here any longer. "Come on, Rex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rex turned to her, his eyes wide with understanding. He had been by her side since the beginning, guiding her through the dangerous parts of the palace, and now he was ready for whatever came next. Together, they would escape. Lyra led the way as they carefully retraced their steps down the tunnel. The noise from the soldiers was still distant, but they couldn't take any chances. The tunnel seemed endless as it twisted and turned, but Lyra pressed on, determined to find an exit. Suddenly, the sound of voices grew louder, much too close. Lyra's stomach twisted in fear. They were almost upon them. "Hide," she whispered urgently to Rex. Rex didn't hesitate. He darted behind a pile of crates and Lyra quickly followed, squeezing into the small space between the crates and the stone wall. She held her breath as the soldiers' voices grew louder. "Did you hear that? I thought I saw something moving," one of the soldiers said. "Maybe she's hiding down here. Let's check the other side of the tunnel," another soldier replied. Lyra could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The soldiers were getting closer. Her grip on the blaster tightened, but she kept her breathing steady, hoping the soldiers wouldn't find them. Rex lay perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the approaching soldiers. The footsteps grew fainter as the soldiers moved past them. Lyra didn't dare to move a muscle, not until she was sure they had passed. Finally, the sounds of their footsteps faded into the distance. Lyra released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We need to go now, Rex," she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. Rex immediately sprang into action, moving with quiet agility as they began their journey down the tunnel once again. Lyra's mind raced, her thoughts shifting between fear and hope. The soldiers were still looking for her, but now she had a plan. She had to get to the palace's outer walls, where there might be a chance of escaping into the nearby forest. The forest offered the possibility of cover and the space they needed to disappear. But the path ahead was dangerous. The palace was heavily guarded, and the soldiers would soon realize she wasn't where they expected her to be. They had to move quickly. As they continued down the tunnel, Lyra began to notice the walls getting thinner. It seemed like they were getting closer to the end. The air was cooler now, and the faint light from the candles had disappeared entirely, leaving them in total darkness. Almost there, Rex, Lyra muttered under her breath. Just as the tunnel began to widen, Lyra heard a faint sound, a quiet clicking, like the sound of metal against stone. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Rex did the same, his muscles tensing. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the tunnel lit up, and Lyra's heart sank. A trap. A bright light flickered in the distance, revealing a group of soldiers standing at the tunnel's exit, weapons drawn. They had been waiting for her. "Don't move," a soldier shouted, his voice cold and commanding. Lyra's blood ran cold. She had walked right into their trap. The soldiers had anticipated her escape, but she wasn't going to give up now. She quickly raised her blaster, aiming at the closest soldier. "Run, Rex," she shouted. Without waiting for a second, Rex dashed forward, knocking into one of the soldiers, sending him crashing to the ground. Lyra fired a shot, sending another soldier stumbling backward. The explosion of noise filled the tunnel, and chaos erupted. With her heart in her throat, Lyra grabbed Rex's collar and ran past the soldiers, weaving through the chaos, determined to escape. They had to fight their way out. Lyra's heart raced as she sprinted down the tunnel, her breath coming in quick bursts. Rex was just ahead, his strong legs carrying him with surprising speed. Behind them, the soldiers shouted angrily, their footsteps growing louder. The chase was on, and Lyra knew they didn't have much time before they were caught. "Faster, Rex," she urged, her voice tight with fear. Rex glanced over his shoulder and gave a small bark, as if encouraging her to keep up. His tail was low, but his determination was clear. The soldiers were closing in, and there was only one way out, through the narrow exit at the far end of the tunnel. Lyra had seen it earlier when they had been hiding, but now it was their only hope. As they rounded a corner, Lyra could hear the soldiers getting closer, their voices echoing in the tunnel. "Stop them," one soldier yelled. "Don't let them escape." Lyra's pulse quickened. They were almost there, just a little further, and they could reach the surface. Rex barked again, his paws pounding against the stone as they reached the exit. But as Lyra reached the edge of the tunnel, she froze. A heavy metal door stood between them and freedom, its surface cold and unforgiving. "No, no, no," Lyra whispered, panic rising in her chest. She rushed to the door, desperately looking for a way to open it. Behind her, the soldiers' footsteps grew louder. Lyra's mind raced. She didn't have time to waste. She had to think. Then she remembered something. The door's lock was controlled by a panel beside it. If she could just reach it. Rex turned around, noticing her hesitation. Without a word, he rushed back to her side and stood by the door, watching the tunnel entrance with alert eyes. Lyra knew she couldn't let the soldiers get any closer. She quickly pressed her hand against the panel, and with a little luck, the door slid open with a low hiss. "Yes," Lyra whispered, relief flooding through her. But there was no time to celebrate. The soldiers were almost upon them. Lyra grabbed Rex's collar and pulled him through the now open door. As they burst into the bright sunlight outside, Lyra shielded her eyes from the harsh light. The fresh air was a welcome change after the musty tunnel, but they were not safe yet. Behind them, the door slammed shut just as the first soldier reached it. Lyra turned and saw the soldier's face pressed against the glass, his eyes filled with rage. But she couldn't stop now. She didn't even have time to catch her breath. She could hear the sound of more soldiers approaching, their voices shouting orders to each other. "We need to move, Rex," she said, her voice shaky but determined. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense. Lyra had no idea where she was going, but she knew it was their best chance. The soldiers would not be able to follow them easily in the thick trees. She ran, Rex at her side, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly through the underbrush. The soldiers would likely search the area, but with any luck, they wouldn't be able to track them down. The sound of the soldiers' shouts faded as Lyra and Rex moved deeper into the forest. Their pace slowed, and Lyra's breath came in ragged gasps, but she couldn't stop. Not yet. They had to put as much distance as possible between them and their pursuers. "We can't stop," Lyra muttered to herself. "We have to keep going." Rex gave a soft whine, glancing back toward the direction of the soldiers. Lyra knew he was just as tired as she was, but they couldn't let up. They couldn't afford to be caught now, not when they were so close to freedom. As they continued running, the trees around them grew denser, the light from the sun barely filtering through the thick canopy above. Lyra's legs were starting to feel like lead, but she pushed forward. There was no turning back now. They had come too far. But in the distance, a new sound reached her ears, a sound that made her blood run cold. The distant hum of a ship. "Rex," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not safe yet." The soldiers weren't just searching on foot. They had brought a ship. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she heard the sound of the ship's engines growing louder. She stopped for a moment, her breath coming in quick gasps. They had no time to lose. The soldiers weren't just searching the area. They were coming for her, and they had a ship. "We need to get out of here," Lyra whispered to Rex, her voice filled with urgency. The dog was already ahead, sniffing the air, his ears perked and his tail low. He could sense the danger just as much as she could. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not after everything they had been through. Without hesitation, Lyra sprinted forward, Rex close behind. She pushed through the dense trees, branches scratching her face, but she didn't slow down. The forest offered some cover, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The ship could hover above the trees, making it easier to spot them. The hum of the ship grew louder, and Lyra knew the soldiers were closing in. She couldn't see them yet, but she could feel them coming. Her pulse raced, and her thoughts were a blur. What could she do? She wasn't trained for this kind of escape, but she had one advantage: Rex. He was fast, and he could help lead her to safety. Lyra ducked beneath a thick branch, her feet slipping on the wet ground. She stumbled but caught herself, never once slowing her pace. She glanced at Rex, who was ahead of her, his nose to the ground, following some unseen trail. "Come on, Rex," Lyra urged, pushing her legs to go faster. Rex looked back at her with those intelligent, knowing eyes before turning back toward the path. Lyra trusted him. He had been her loyal companion through thick and thin, and she had no doubt he would get them through this. Behind them, the sound of the ship became deafening. It wasn't just a small ship. It was a large military vessel, and it was getting closer. Lyra's stomach twisted with dread. If they didn't find a way to shake them off, they were done for. Up ahead, Rex suddenly stopped, his nose in the air, ears stiff. Lyra pulled up short behind him. He was watching something in the distance, his body tense, ready to move again at a moment's notice. Lyra crouched beside him, peering through the trees. In the distance, she saw the ship, its large shadow casting an eerie glow over the forest floor. It was hovering low, just above the tree line. The soldiers inside it would be scanning the area, looking for any sign of movement. "We have to move fast," Lyra muttered. She could feel the heat of the ship's engines on her skin, and she knew they didn't have much time. Rex took off suddenly, moving with surprising speed through the underbrush. Lyra had to scramble to keep up, pushing past thick vines and branches that tried to grab at her. She barely noticed the pain in her legs anymore, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Every second counted. The ship passed overhead, its shadow casting over them like a dark cloud. Lyra ducked lower, pressing herself against the trunk of a tree. She could hear the ship's engines whirring and the sound of soldiers speaking to each other, their voices muffled but clear enough to understand. Where are they? They couldn't have gone far. We'll catch them. Don't worry. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The soldiers were getting closer. She could hear their voices, and she knew they were just on the other side of the trees. She felt trapped, unable to move without being seen. Rex was still ahead, crouching low to the ground. He seemed to sense her fear, and without hesitation, he started moving again, weaving in and out of the trees. Lyra followed him, her heart racing. She didn't know where they were going, but she trusted him. She had to trust him. As they moved deeper into the forest, Lyra felt the pressure of the soldiers chasing them, but she kept her eyes fixed on Rex. He was their guide, their only hope. But the sound of the ship was still close. Too close. And Lyra knew they couldn't outrun it forever. They needed to find cover. And fast. Lyra's heart raced as she followed Rex deeper into the forest. The hum of the ship's engine still filled the air, and she could hear the soldiers calling to each other. They were getting closer. It wouldn't be long before they were spotted. Rex darted ahead, moving through the trees with ease. His keen senses were guiding them, but Lyra knew they couldn't run forever. They needed to find shelter, somewhere the soldiers couldn't easily find them. But the forest was dense, and they were running out of time. As they moved through the thick brush, Lyra's thoughts were all over the place. She couldn't stop thinking about the alien princess and the powerful beings who had left her behind. Lyra knew she was nothing special, just a poor, lost girl with no place in the world. Yet here she was, running for her life, chased by soldiers because of some twisted fate. "Come on, Rex," Lyra whispered, urging the dog to move faster. She was slowing down, her legs feeling heavier with each step. The forest felt endless, and the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. Rex, ever the loyal companion, stopped suddenly. Lyra nearly crashed into him as he turned his head toward a narrow gap in the trees. The dog's eyes shone with determination. He had found something. "What is it, boy?" Lyra asked, gasping for air. She could see the ship hovering above, still circling the area. But now the sounds seemed distant, as if they hadn't noticed them yet. Rex gave a sharp bark and ran through the gap in the trees. Lyra quickly followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what Rex had found, but she had no choice but to trust him. The gap opened into a small clearing, and for a moment, Lyra thought they were trapped. But then she saw it. At the far side of the clearing, hidden under a thick layer of vines and branches, was an old building. It was small, almost like a shack, but it was solid and well hidden. There was no sign of life around it. Rex barked again, looking at Lyra with a hopeful expression. It was clear he had found the shelter they needed. "Good boy," Lyra whispered, running toward the building. She didn't know if it was safe, but it was their best chance. As they reached the entrance, Lyra hesitated for a moment. The door was heavy, but Rex was already pushing it open with his nose. They rushed inside, and Lyra slammed the door shut behind them. The shack was dark and musty, but it would do. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. The sounds of the ship were growing fainter, but she knew they hadn't escaped yet. The soldiers could still be searching, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. Rex sat by her side, panting, his eyes alert as he listened to the sounds outside. Lyra reached down and petted him, her heart swelling with gratitude. Without him, she would have been lost. But now, they were safe, for the moment. Lyra's mind raced. How long would they have to stay hidden? What would happen if the soldiers found them? She knew the answer. They wouldn't let her go. But she also knew that they couldn't stay in the shack forever. They had to keep moving. But for now, this small shelter was all they had. Rex's ears perked up as he sniffed the air. Lyra quickly followed his gaze, looking out through a small crack in the wall. The ship was still hovering above, but it was moving away, slowly. The soldiers had given up. For now. Lyra let out a shaky breath of relief, but she knew this wasn't over. They had to keep going. The soldiers would return, and when they did, Lyra would have to be ready. She couldn't afford to wait around and hope for the best. There was a long road ahead, and it was up to her to survive. "We can do this, Rex," Lyra whispered, her voice steady now. "We'll get through this together." Rex looked up at her, his eyes filled with trust. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The air was thick with tension as Lyra sat in the small shack, her mind racing with thoughts of what came next. She couldn't help but replay the events of the last few hours. She had been left to die, cast aside by her own people. But then Rex had come, her loyal companion, her savior. Together, they had found shelter, and now they waited, hoping the soldiers would not return. Rex, ever watchful, lay at her feet, his ears perked up at every sound. Lyra tried to rest, but her thoughts were scattered. What was she supposed to do now? Where could she go? She had no plan, no allies. She was alone in an unknown world, with only Rex by her side. As the hours passed, Lyra began to grow restless. The silence of the forest was almost suffocating. She knew the soldiers would be back. They wouldn't stop until they found her. She had to do something, anything, to survive. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. Rex stood up, his body tense, and Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, listening. The noise came again, louder this time, and it was not the sound of the ship's engines. It was footsteps. Lyra quickly motioned for Rex to stay quiet. The dog crouched low, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Lyra slowly moved toward the crack in the wall, peering out cautiously. Her heart raced in her chest as she strained to see through the small gap. Through the trees, she could make out a figure, a man, walking alone. His movements were calm, deliberate. He was not a soldier, Lyra could tell. The uniform was different, simpler. She didn't know who he was, but he was getting closer. Lyra's mind raced. Should she hide? Should she confront him? But before she could make a decision, Rex growled softly, the sound low and warning. The stranger froze, looking directly at the shack. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Had he seen her? Was this a trap? She reached for a small stone on the ground, ready to defend herself if necessary. The man took a step forward, then stopped. He seemed to be thinking, his eyes narrowing as he studied the shack. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Are you in there?" he called, his voice steady but kind. Lyra was taken aback. How could he know? Had he been watching her? She hesitated, then slowly pushed the door open a crack, just enough to speak through. "Who are you?" Lyra asked, trying to sound brave, though her voice trembled slightly. "What do you want?" The man smiled, his face warm but weary. "My name is Cole. I saw you running, and I didn't think it was safe for you to be alone out here. The soldiers will come back. They won't stop until they find you." Lyra's heart raced. He knew about the soldiers, but who was he? And why was he helping her? She had no time to question him. She had to make a decision quickly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole's expression softened. "I've seen the way they treat people like you," he said, his voice tinged with anger. "I couldn't just let you die out here. I don't know what they've done to you, but I know you don't deserve this. I can help you." Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Could she trust him? She wasn't sure, but she had no other choice. The soldiers would be back soon, and if she stayed here, she was as good as dead. "Come inside," she said quietly, opening the door wider. "But we have to be careful. The soldiers are looking for me." Cole stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small room before resting on Rex, who had watched the entire exchange with cautious eyes. "Don't worry," Cole said, his voice reassuring. "I'll help you. I'll get you out of here." Lyra felt a weight lift off her shoulders, but the fear still lingered. The soldiers would be back. But for the first time since everything had started, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. With Rex and Cole by her side, maybe, just maybe, there was a chance she could escape. "We need a plan," she said, her voice steady. "What can we do?" Cole smiled again. "We'll figure it out. Together." The day had come. Lyra knew the soldiers would return soon. They always did. Their search for her had grown more desperate with each passing hour. But now, with Cole by her side and Rex guarding the door, she felt a sense of strength she hadn't felt before. For the first time, she had allies. Cole had been planning all night, mapping out their escape. He knew the forest better than anyone, and he had a route in mind, one that could lead them to a hidden base deep in the mountains. But the soldiers were relentless, and there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. They had no choice but to try. "Are you ready?" Cole asked, his voice steady but low. Lyra could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't just doing this for her. He was doing it because he couldn't stand to see the cruelty of the soldiers anymore. They had been nothing but monsters to her, but Cole was different. He was her chance. Lyra took a deep breath. "Yes, we can't wait any longer." They had prepared as best as they could. The shack they were hiding in was a safe place for now, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Lyra could hear the faint hum of vehicles in the distance, signaling the approach of the soldiers. Time was running out. Cole motioned for Lyra to follow him. "Stay close. We'll move quickly and quietly. Rex, stay alert." The dog growled softly in response, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the room. Lyra had never seen Rex so focused. He knew what was at stake, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. She felt a wave of gratitude for the loyal dog. If not for him, she wouldn't have survived this long. The trio moved cautiously through the forest, their steps soft against the ground. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made Lyra's heart race, but Cole remained calm, guiding her with his quiet presence. He had a way of making everything seem less dangerous, even when the situation was dire. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing, a spot where the trees parted just enough for them to see the path ahead. It was the perfect place to rest for a moment, and Cole signaled for Lyra to stop. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low but hopeful. "But we have to move fast." Lyra nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She knew they couldn't stop for long. The soldiers were close now, and if they spotted them, there would be no escape. She glanced around, hoping to spot any signs of movement, but the forest was still. Suddenly, the sound of engines roared in the distance. The soldiers had arrived. They were closing in, and fast. Lyra's heart dropped. "We have to go now," Cole shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. Rex barked, urging them to move quicker. They ran, adrenaline pumping through their veins, each step bringing them closer to safety. Lyra's legs burned with the effort, but she pushed herself harder, knowing there was no other choice. She couldn't let the soldiers catch them now. As they neared the mountain base, the sound of pursuit grew louder. The soldiers were catching up. Lyra's fear turned to panic, but Cole remained calm, his voice firm. "Just a little further. We're almost there." In the final moments, as the soldiers' shouts echoed through the trees, they'd reached the base. Lyra couldn't believe it. She had made it. They had made it. Inside the base, she collapsed against the wall, breathing heavily. Rex sat beside her, his body still tense, but relieved. Cole stood guard, watching the entrance, but even he allowed himself a brief moment of rest. They had done it. Against all odds, they had escaped. But Lyra knew this was just the beginning. The soldiers would never stop hunting her, but now she had a chance to fight back. With Cole by her side, and Rex loyal to the end, she was no longer alone. "Thank you," Lyra whispered, looking up at Cole with gratitude in her eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you." Cole smiled, his eyes softening. "We're not done yet. We'll make sure they never hurt you again." And for the first time in her life, Lyra believed that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future.